Hello everyone, my name is Agata Staniewicz, and in this presentation I'll talk about some of the work I've done during my PhD on incorporating acoustic surveys into the population monitoring of threatened African crocodiles. Now before I start, I'd like to thank all the people and institutions that have helped me throughout my PhD and made this project possible. Traditional crocodile surveys usually involve using a spotlight or a torch to detect the light reflected in the eye of the crocodile at night. And this method works very well for species that are conspicuous or for crocodiles that live in fairly open, accessible habitats, but it becomes a lot less effective for crocodile species that live in habitats like this, flooded forests or densely vegetated swamps, where the vegetation can conceal the animal and also make it very difficult or impossible to access for the observer. So unfortunately, some of the least known and also most critically endangered crocodilian species live in such habitats. And one of the possible ways we can find out more about them and inform conservation better is through the use of methods which employ use of acoustic signals in the monitoring. Crocodilians are the most vocal of all reptiles, and they use acoustic signals throughout all stages of their lives. So hatchlings use hatching calls to synchronize emergence from the nest, and also use contact calls to maintain group cohesion as a group of hatchlings when they're small. They also produce distress calls upon capture, which sound like this. And they're used to solicit help from other individuals, particularly adults, when the animal is caught. Now, adults crocodilians produce acoustic signals mostly during courtship and territory defense, and some of the most prominent of these calls are called bellows when they're produced by alligators, or roars when they're produced by crocodiles. They sound like this. This was a bellow by an American alligator. Now, when males produce the bellows or roars, they often include an infrasound component to the call, which can be seen as the water dance on the surface of the water. Most of our knowledge about crocodilian communication and the signal types comes from the studies done on alligators, because these are considered to be the most vocal of all crocodilians, and also they're some of the most accessible crocodilians to researchers. There have also been some studies on the Nile crocodile communication, particularly between parents and offspring, but there's been very little work done, and there's very little known about the communication in other African crocodilians. So in Africa, there are at least 7 species of crocodilians. One of the most well-known is the Nile crocodile, the Crocodilus niloticus, which has the broadest distribution range on the continent. And a similar species in ecology and morphology is the West African crocodile, Crocodilus zucus, which has been only recently recognized and inhabits the western part of the continent. Both of these species live mostly in quite open habitats, and the Nile crocodile is listed as least concern on the IUCN Red List of Threatened Species, while the West African crocodile, Crocodilus zucus, is still awaiting formal assessment. Then we have the slender-snouted crocodiles, of which there are actually 2 species. The West African slender-snouted crocodile, Mekistops cataphractus, and also the Central African slender-snouted crocodile, Mekistops leptorhynchus. Both of them are critically endangered, and they're some of the rarest and also least studied of all the crocodilians in the world. They inhabit mostly rivers and lakes in tropical forests, which are quite difficult to access, which explains why there is very little known about them still. Finally, we have dwarf crocodiles, of which there are at least 3 species, possibly more, and are still awaiting formal description. Dwarf crocodiles are classified as vulnerable, and they're sympatric in their range to the slender-snouted crocodiles. But unlike slender-snouted crocodiles, dwarf crocodiles prefer smaller streams and ponds deeper in the tropical forests. And they can often be spotted on the forest floor, so they're more terrestrial of the crocodilians. And as you can see on this photo on the left, they can be quite well camouflaged, which makes them fairly difficult to survey. So one of the questions for my PhD was to investigate the possibility of using passive acoustic monitoring to monitor the dwarf crocodiles in the forest. But to do this, we needed to determine what sounds the dwarf crocodiles actually make, because they haven't really been studied before. So I've recorded a pair of dwarf crocodiles, Osteolamus tetraspis, at Bristol Zoo for over a month, using both microphone and a hydrophone. And I've also analyzed recordings from the wild recorded by the Elephant Listening Project while recording forest elephants. And these recordings were thought to be of the dwarf crocodiles, but needed formal confirmation. So I've analyzed 97 calls from the Bristol Zoo and 168 calls from Gabon. And I've identified 4 types of calls. All were unlike the typical roar described for the crocodilians, and particularly for the crocodiles. So firstly, we had the drums, which are lower frequency, short pulses. Then we have rumbles, which are low frequency calls but longer than the drums, with a visible harmonic structure. Then we had the moo, which sounds a bit like a moo and is a higher frequency call, also with a visible harmonic structure and frequency modulation. And it usually appeared alone or in a sequence of these moos without other call types. Finally, we had gusts, which were a bit similar to moos but had no harmonic structure and usually occurred together with the drum and rumble calls. Now, these calls from the captivity match those from the wild, so they were likely the same species recorded in the wild by the Elephant Listening Project as the one from Bristol Zoo. And all 4 types of calls were present both in the wild and in captivity. At this point, we don't know what the context of the production of these calls, but this is for further studies. Then, slender-snouted crocodiles, we focused on 2 populations, the West African slender-snouted crocodile in Tai National Park in Côte d'Ivoire, and the Central African slender-snouted crocodile in Mukalabadudu National Park in Gabon. So you can see in the picture on the right from the habitat, in both areas it's a larger river flowing through the tropical forests. And here we tried the passive acoustic monitoring, installing hydrophones and microphones along the river in different locations, recording continuously for 3 days in each location, with recordings of over a month in both countries. But unfortunately, this wasn't very effective. And although we've seen lots of slender-snouted crocodiles during the nightly spotlight surveys, during an entire month of recording, these 4 calls you see on the spectrogram were the only crocodile calls recorded through the passive acoustic monitoring. So clearly this is not a method that works particularly well for this species. Fortunately, slender-snouted crocodiles produce distress calls upon capture, and they produce them throughout all stages of their lives. But the distress calls made by small juveniles attract conspecifics. So we've incorporated the playback of the distress calls into the spotlight surveys, and I'll play you a clip of the example of this playback here. And to compare this to the detection rates with the spotlight-only surveys over the same 10-kilometer stretches of the river. And we found that indeed adding the playback significantly increased the detection rates, both in Côte d'Ivoire and in Gabon. The detection rates in Gabon were actually twice the numbers with the playback as without the playback of crocodiles spotted per kilometer. And this might be due to the larger population available in Gabon as the area where the experiment was performed is one of the largest and still healthiest population of the species. So, in conclusion, we've uncovered a previously unknown diversity of calls of the dwarf crocodiles Ostreolamus tetraspis, which is likely that other dwarf crocodile species have similar diversity that still needs to be studied, and might be used to trial and adopt possible acoustic monitoring for the species in the wild. For slender-snouted crocodiles, the passive acoustic monitoring is unlikely to be particularly effective. However, incorporating the playback of distress calls into the spotlight surface significantly increases detectability, and so might provide more information and be more effective for future conservation and monitoring projects. Thank you.